Hey guys, I'm Yurouzi. This is the part 12 of What If Naruto and Team 7 was actually trained by Kakashi. Kakashi survived his losses in spirit as well as in body, and having learned both wisdom and intellect from his experiences, he now seeks to pass those traits on to his students. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 47, Into Jashin's Open Arms. Wisdom often comes with age. This is not always the case. A youth can well be the wisest person in the room, and elders can be quite foolish. Still, many beings become wiser as they age, frequently enough that saying so is considered a wise thing to say, usually by the aged people who say it. No amount of age could help in the case of Haiden and Zidane, it seemed. Haiden grabbed a rock and hefted it thoughtfully before he bashed Zidane in the face with it, smashing his freshly healed nose flat and splattering blood on the ground. How a weak little pussy like you became high priest. Zidane snorted as his nose slowly reformed, only adding to the red liquid slowly covering this part of the road. He turned and picked up a bench from the side of the road. He raised it over his head and brought it down, breaking it in half as he struck Haiden in the head. There was a sickening crunch, and Haiden's head rolled to one side, unsupported. Of course you would be confused, heathen. Only a brainless grunt like yourself would sacrifice your superior. Haiden pushed his head up, cracking his neck even as it reformed itself, then ripped one of the crude iron feet from the bench and stabbed Zidane in the gut with it. The man tried to dodge, but only managed to get stabbed in the side instead of the front. It had been 20 minutes, and the once fleeing crowd had eventually stopped fleeing, then returned to watch. The two cultists had been more creative at first. They used broken glass as blades, chunks of wood as bludgeons. The broken bottle fight had been a delightful display of skill. The dual-wielding torch duel had ended with an impressive display of sparks when all 4 torches exploded simultaneously. But finally, after 18 minutes, the two seemed to have run out of creativity, and had settled for hitting one another brutally, over and over again, apparently planning on just going at it until one of them stopped regrowing. They moved only as much as it took to grab another weapon and use it against their foe. Haiden would stand and wait for the blow, while Zidane at least would step to the side or block the attack, although this more often than not resulted in severe limb damage. No skill, no prowess, just two nearly unkillable meatheads taking turns breaking objects on one another. The consensus of the crowd, if put into a single sentence, would read one of them will have to break eventually, right? If anything passed through the minds of the two cultists, other than the occasional sharp object, it was the same thought. Only one could truly be favored by Almighty Jashin, and that was obviously me, the thought would go. At least until the next bit of detritus was inserted into their brainpan. Kankaro favored stealth. He was not a brawler like Naruto. His entire style revolved around not being seen by his opponent, fooling that foe into making a mistake so he could strike. He was an assassin. Unfortunately, what he was facing was the worst possible opponent for him. Somit was standing out in the open atop one of the taller buildings in the town, in plain view of the streets and rooftops around him. He didn't look for Kankaro. He didn't need to. He had minions for that. Karasu had been reduced to scrap a few minutes earlier, and yet the puppeteer himself was still hiding. Somit's mummified minions continued their patrols, sweeping through the streets and alleyways and homes at random. Occasionally one would approach, dragging a dead person for inspection, but those they delivered so far had been civilians. Somit was not one for wasting resources. It took mere seconds to take control of the person's skeleton and drain it of its fluids, and he did so with a faint smile. Each one was dedicated to Almighty Jashin, his holy symbol drawn on their skull with their own drying blood. Then they would rise, the remaining blood and fluids pouring from their bodies and off the roof. The ground below was caked in filth from their excretions. A clicking noise heralded the return of one of his minions, dragging a bundle wrapped in black cloth. "Ah," said Somit, smiling, "what have you brought to me, my minion?" He leaned over and inspected the bundle. The black cloth was rough, low quality, but covering the face was a very distinctive and recognizable hat. Somit reached out to remove the hat, then jumped to one side as the minion that brought it suddenly jerked one of its arms, revealing a crude shank made of bone and smeared with some unknown but certainly deadly substance. With a flick of his hand, Somit released the minion, watching it fall to the ground below, disintegrating into a pile of dust as it fell. He looked around, then grinned when he spotted the young puppeteer standing, crouched and barely visible on top of a steep-roofed building several doors down. "So, you decided to appear before me?" shouted Somit. "Maybe do a little pleading before you join my army." He smirked as his minions closed in on the figure, piling atop one another to reach the rooftop. Somit was still smirking when the figure exploded, blowing apart the roof, the house, and every minion in the area. He raised his hands, already summoning those remaining to defend him, when he felt the icy steel blade slip into his back. "No," said Kankaro, twisting the blade. "I decided to appear behind you." "How?" said Somit weakly, trying to pull himself away from Kankaro's grip. "They're only puppets," said Kankaro. "You wave your hands dramatically, but you don't actually direct them. You spread your chakra so thin maintaining the horde that it was easy to overpower one of them and take control." Unseen by Kankaro, Somit smiled. He lurched forward, pulling himself off of Kankaro's blade, turning to grab Kankaro by the wrist as he did so. His touch was gentle, light as a feather, yet his grip was unbreakable. Kankaro looked down to see a small black mark encircling his wrist where Somit was holding him, dark blisters beginning to form. Somit spun, tossing Kankaro off the building and cackling gleefully. "You take such pride in your toy, you didn't stop to think further. You see puppets? I see practice." He raised his arms wide, his robe drifting open to reveal his body. His skin was dark and flaking, clinging to his bones as if it was painted onto them. He wore nothing to preserve his modesty, and Kankaro could see that Somit had removed the need for such clothing. His body was covered in rough scars and poorly done stitching, and sitting proudly on his skinny chest was a gold amulet depicting the symbol of his chosen deity. "I have embraced what you heathens flee from. I do not fear death, I have become death." As Kankaro got to his feet, cradling his slowly swelling left arm, Somit reached back and touched where he had been stabbed. The hand came back covered in red dust. Then Somit began to form hand signs, signs that Kankaro recognized them from his sister's training. Somit finished his signs and raised his fist high, showing how it faintly pulsed with dark power. "Embrace your fate, creature. Fight or flee, it matters not. You all go to Jashin in the end." He slammed his fist into the roof, and from his hand came a series of black lines, closely written kanji flowing outwards to form a circle far bigger than Kankaro had ever seen, stretching for blocks around them both. "Kuchios no Jutsu." Sekit was growing vexed. The little girl he'd started stalking was remarkably paranoid, and more importantly, she was applying that paranoia by effectively defending herself. He had his favorite games, like most killers of his pedigree. He liked to chase people into buildings, let them lock up all the doors, huddle in a closet or bedroom, completely unaware that he was slowly oozing from the floorboards. Or sometimes the sink or tub if the place had indoor plumbing. Or he could drip through the ceiling. It never stopped being amusing, the way people would look up into his face as he fell upon them. Against ninja, he would often wait for them to land on a roof, then send a single blade of blood up through the roof, and them. Unfortunately, this girl was not playing along. She never went indoors. Instead, she kept to the tops of the buildings. She would often rest on top of a weather vane, or on a windowsill, minimizing his approach options. And she never hung around long enough for him to get within range. He'd managed to tag her once, throwing some of his blood at her, formed into a delightfully sharp blade. The cut across her leg hobbled her, keeping her from simply outpacing Sekit, but not enough to prevent her from leading him on a vexing chase. An accident, but a happy one. Slow chases were always more rewarding at the climax. He was going to enjoy it when he caught her. He already knew how she would die. He'd slice her legs off at the knees, then he'd slowly slide his blood blade into her chest and gently pierce her heart. He knew his work, and she would not die until he could flow into her veins and shred her from the inside out, bathing in her screams and tears and red blood. He shivered in anticipation, his liquid body rippling from where he was hiding under a wagon. On the last few approaches, she had begun to show signs of exhaustion. The fact that she had yet to bind her leg must have been contributing. Sekit had attacked at range every time she tried to bandage it. Ranged attacks were not Sekit's style. He preferred a more intimate death for his prey. But he didn't need to hit her again, just keep her from having the time and space to bandage that lovely gash on her silky smooth leg. Then, an opportunity for some extra fun arose. Passing not 30 feet from him was the blonde-haired boy his girl had been with earlier, dressed in some ludicrous outfit, a red suit with a comically large top hat. He was walking with a swagger, a cane tucked under his arm and a smile on his face. He didn't seem to notice the girl, crouched on the roof above and staring at him with her pretty little mouth agape. He didn't even pay attention to the bloody trail she was leaving. What fun! Sekit knew the type. The boy was stout, well-muscled. A brawler, he would guess, not a delicate vivisectionist like Sekit, but a brute force sort of fighter. As dumb as the bricks he broke in training, no doubt. He stood no chance. The boy's skin was so delightfully clean, except for those ugly whisker marks. He glared at those damned marks, so disgusting and impure. But no matter. Everyone looked the same from inside anyhow, and hopefully the girl would scream in time to give the boy a little bit of warning before Sekit popped him like a balloon. He started to sink low to the ground, running through the cracks and crevices of the stones of the street, inching forward, barely faster than the boy was walking. But when the boy turned and looked directly at Sekit, he didn't flinch or shout. He grinned. Sekit grinned back, slowly reforming his body until it was roughly human-shaped. "No fear, little boy?" he asked, holding his hands out, blades of blood forming from his fingers. "Nah," the boy replied, his grin stretching those blemishes. Sekit twitched slightly. "I am a creature of legend, implacable, unstoppable. I stalk and kill Chunin for fun and Jonin for sport. Every inch of my liquid body can become a blade. I take pleasure, so much pleasure, in ripping people apart from the inside." "And you feel no fear?" "Nope," the boy said. "Are you damaged?" Sekit's head tilted slightly. "Do you delude yourself into thinking I will somehow spare you if you'll be my friend?" "Nah. You don't seem friendly." "I just have something more important to worry about." "What?" He lunged forward, scooping the boy up in his arms, holding him aloft. "What can possibly be more important than your impending and delightfully gruesome demise?" The boy grinned. "Don't you know, mister? It's game time." That's when the boy detonated. Sekit felt his body distend and then scatter under the force of the explosion, splattering him loosely against the nearest wall. He pulled himself together and began to search for his prey, but stopped when, a few buildings down, a couple identical copies of the same boy stepped out of a doorway and tossed a pair of yellow discs at him. They floated gently in his direction, and when he reached out to bat them away, they exploded as well. Sekit soon discovered two things about his opponent. First, the boy was able to make physical clones that had no qualms about using explosives, even when they would be disrupted by the blast. The second was that everything the boy carried exploded. The yellow discs, the diving kites, the little shogi boards hidden in innocuous places, they all exploded. Even the potatoes that started landing near him after a few minutes exploded, quite vigorously. His eyes were filled with fire and light, his mind filled with rage, and for a long time, he thought of nothing but smashing every little clone he could see. Naruto and a pair of his clones stood atop a multi-story house, one of the few in the neighborhood, looking down at the streets and alleys below. 2.5 north, 0.6 east, said one clone, never taking his eyes off the spyglass it held in his hands. The second, leaning over the other side of the roof, flashed a series of hand signs to the three teams of clones below, causing them to grunt as they pushed and pulled the massive potato cannons they had built into a new firing position. In each team, one member stood aside quietly and quickly wrapped a potato with a string of explosive tags for the next shot. They were firing at half speed, one potato per minute, just trying to keep the blood cultist occupied, giving the thing one more distraction, while a street away, another three teams worked on another set of cannons. Once those three teams joined in, more teams would be created. They still had not figured out how to make the potato cannon last more than 20 shots, but it didn't matter when you could just make more. And with the indirect fire, nearly vertical arc, and all the other explosions from the ground teams, the cult member would probably be a while before he figured out where the missiles were coming from. The real Naruto, however, was occupied with trying to get Temari to stay still. "Relax," he said quietly, one hand on her shoulder, holding her down as gently as he could. Temari snarled and struggled weakly against his strength. "I need to get out there. You need to stop moving and wait until you recover," he said mildly in return. "You lost a lot of blood." She grabbed his arm and heaved, ignoring the fact that she could not move his arm even with two of her own in her current state. "I'm not going to let that asshole win. Let me fight." Naruto reached out with his other arm and pressed down on her shoulders firmly. "Temari, I had to carry you up here. I got the bleeding to stop, but you're still weak from it. I should have a couple clones literally carrying you out of here, and I would, but the town is still a mess, and your brother would literally kill me if something happened to you. Temari slumped back, but her glare only intensified. Let me up. What the fuck is wrong with you? He shouted, finally reaching the limit of his temper. You literally almost died. You would be dead if I didn't manage to find you. Why are you so insistent on going out there? Because I won't be useless. The last shout seemed to take some of her strength with it, and she finally stopped struggling and slumped. I won't be useless, she said again, her voice almost a whisper. I refuse weakness. I will not be some girl, to be rescued and coddled and protected. Naruto lifted his hands and held them up placatingly. Hey, hold up now. You beat my ass in spars often enough, and Sakura does too. I'm not going to play the man card on you. He sighed and glanced at the spotter clone before sitting back. Yes, I'm trying to protect you. He raised a hand, waving away whatever she was going to say. Not because you're a girl or something. Boy, girl, whatever Haku is, I don't care. I'll never step in and be all dashing and dramatic in a tuxedo or cape or whatever and protect you because you're a girl. Even if I could find a tuxedo out here, you'd just end up murdering me in it for that. I'd never protect you for being weak or female or my long-lost sister or something. I'll protect you because I want you to live. He frowned and glanced at the spotter again, keeping track of where the enemy was. We're shinobi. Odds are we're going to die violent deaths. And I can't always be here to help, even with the clones. But I am here, now, and I have no intention of letting you charge into your untimely doom because you think you need to prove your worth. I'm here to help, so, just let me. Temari continued to glare for a moment, but eventually the glare turned into a smirk. Funny, I thought that ringmaster was wearing a tuxedo. And a cape. Naruto chuckled and scratched the back of his head. I didn't mean that bit literally. His arm dropped, and he grinned at Temari. You gonna sit back and stay alive for me now? Temari looked up at Naruto, sitting in the middle of an active battlefield while explosions rocked the streets around them and grinning as if they meant nothing to him, and decided that for just this once, it would be okay to trust in someone else's strength. Or maybe that was the blood loss speaking. Either way, she felt her eyes close, and the last thing she said before she drifted out of consciousness was, this time. Naruto shook his head and stood beside the spotter, looking down at the fight below. After a moment, he made a clone and then dispelled it, sending out a new batch of orders to his minions. Moments later, he got a return report. The undead were largely contained in one section of the town, although the clones could not get into that area now that there were birds covering the air. The town was now nearly empty of civilians, as shinobi went door to door, looking for potential danger. And Haydn and the cultist leader were still hitting each other mindlessly. Then another clone popped and sent him a memory, and he lunged forward, narrowly avoiding the spear of blood that pierced the roof where he had been moments ago. He instinctively threw a kunai at the bloody creature rising up from the crack, and was unsurprised when it caught the blade in passing. He stood and turned fully to face his foe, even as the former spotter grabbed Temari and took off. Oh, you're running away with the girl. Does this mean you finally fear me, little boy? Asked Sekit, his body contorting as countless spines and blades emerged from it. Naruto snorted and drew his swords. I've literally fought the embodiment of fear. I've also faced down Orochimaru of the Sannin by blocking his sword with my forehead. He raised one hand flat and twisted it back and forth, as if measuring something. You're maybe, 4th tier scary. Just above scary movie, just below Sakura when she's on a tear. Sekit stared at the boy for a moment, then started to laugh. Big words for a little boy who can't win. Naruto rolled his eyes and reached deep into himself, drawing out some of the Kyuubi's power. I don't need to win. You just need to lose. Sekit snarled and lunged, arms outstretched. Kankaro looked at his hand. The black mark that the cultist had placed on him had grown as Kankaro had tried to evade the things chasing him. The moment the summon went off, the ground had come alive with grasping arms, reaching out to snatch at him in passing, even as they pushed and pulled to lift their rotten bodies out of the ground. Each one wore the tattered remains of a shinobi uniform. Most still had their old headbands, declaring their old allegiances even in death. And all of them followed him, mindlessly. They were easy to evade, as slow as they moved, but almost impossible to avoid, so numerous that he could rarely turn a corner and not run into a few. They were stupid, but they were impossible to distract once they spotted him, and over time, more and more had surrounded his area, slowly herding him into tighter confines. Attempts to flee by rooftop proved to be impossible. Fast-moving birds, barely more than skin and claws and feathers, patrolled the sky. If they spotted him, they attacked, clawing at his face, trying to dig out his eyes, and all with the mindless ferocity of a creature that could not die. Worst of all, he could no longer feel his hand. It was blackened and withered, and gave off a greasy stench that made Kankaro feel sickened, not just by the smell, but what the smell represented. The blackness was slowly creeping up his arm, and he knew if it reached his chest, he would die. There's only one way I can be certain to stop it. He ducked into an abandoned home and wedged a chair under the door. They'd find him soon enough, and the improvised door would only hold them off a couple extra seconds, but he needed those seconds. He cut his left sleeve apart and sighed as he gazed at his ruined hand. The black had seeped up his arm, already halfway to his elbow. He drew two kunai, gripping the corded handle of the first one in his teeth and beginning to cut with the other. Haydn glared up at Zidane, who smiled back down at him. "Shouldn't you say something cheesy?" asked the cultist leader. "You know, don't lose your head, or something," Haydn grumbled when Zidane grabbed his hair and picked him up, bringing the decapitated head to eye level. "I always was curious how this trick worked. You have no lungs, technically no larynx, and yet you can speak." Zidane flipped Haydn's head over, glancing at the shorn neck and ignoring the continued cussing. "Well, it looks like you're technically immortal too," Zidane said, flipping Haydn back to look him in the eye. "Don't heal like me, takes a lot longer, but what do you expect from a fallen servant?" Haydn snarled, vibrating violently in Zidane's hands. "I'll get my body back someday, and when I do..." Zidane chucked and tossed Haydn lightly into the air as he began to walk down the street. "This is true," he said. "Heathen though you may be, I will at least respect your tenacity. And I dislike the idea of leaving an enemy around to come back later." He looked around and then smiled cheerfully when he spotted a smithy. He walked in, slapping Haydn's head on the anvil before rummaging around the shop. Eventually he came back, placing a large crucible on the floor and dumping several piles of metal scrap into it. Haydn looked down to the thick metal bucket and grunted. "Little early to give yourself medals, ain't it?" Zidane laughed, made several hand signs, and began to breathe fire into the piled metal. He held that pose for nearly a minute, the flames growing hotter and hotter, until he ran out of breath and gasped. But he smiled as he looked down at the bubbling cauldron. "I don't want any trophy," said Zidane cheerfully, hoisting Haydn's head high. "Except for maybe your head mounted on my wall, forever encased in unyielding metal. I hope I can still hear you scream in there. Hope my children can too, and their children as well." Haydn's eyes rolled, looking down at the metal below, and his vicious grin faltered. "Any last words, heathen, before you begin your eternal punishment?" "Don't lose your head," said Haydn, his grin returning in full. Zidane didn't have time to ask what Haydn meant. With a quiet swish, Nagase's blade passed through skin, muscle, and bone, all without slowing in the slightest. The Ishinin did not waste time with words. He stepped forward, and before Zidane's head began to drop, the blade whipped out again, blunt edge first, and slapped the falling head into the cauldron. Nagase winced as the sizzling sound and greasy smell of burning flesh and hair filled the smithy. He then reached down and picked up Haydn's head by the hair. "Hey, heathen-san, wanna slap my noggin back on my body for me?" Nagase glared at the head. "Ah! Please?" asked Haydn, grinning from ear to ear. "Come on, man, I'm dripping all over here." Nagase managed to hold his glare a few seconds more before his own grin came out. "You should stay here." Kankaro's eyes snapped open, and he groaned in pain. He could barely remember what had been happening. Skinning a limb with improvised surgery was, as it turned out, very distracting, and every memory he had of the time afterwards had been warped and colored by the ever-burning agony hidden in his tied-off sleeve. But he remembered fighting, battering his way through the undead shinobi, jumping through windows and doorways, fighting to make space for every breath. And he remembered struggling onto the roof of a building, watching the birds begin their dive, and then there was a buzzing noise, and the roof gave way beneath him, and he fell into darkness. He sat up, grunting at the pain, and looked around. He was sitting in the midst of rubble. Very small bits of wood, and tiny white shards, and bits of gray and blue and black cloth, all spread out in an almost uniform carpet covering a clearing in the middle of the town. He got to his knees, only for an arm to push him back down, and he looked up to see the gate guard, Sato, leaning over him. "Stay here, it's safer if I don't have to account for your location." Kankaro opened his mouth, but shut it when a wooden wall at the edge of the clearing blew apart. After a moment, several dead shinobi stumbled through the hole, followed by Somit, whose wrinkled face was locked into a grin. "So, here lies the fabled puppet master of Sunigakure, reduced to impotence. No puppets, no good weapons, why, not even a hand to spare." Sato stood and crossed his arms. "Stranger, you have attacked this town and its people, all under the watchful eye of Ishigakure. There is only one penalty for such an affront." Somit gave a theatrical yawn and pretended to examine his fingernails. More of his undead horde pushed through the surrounding walls, until there was no more than 30 feet between the wall of flesh and the two shinobi in the middle. From somewhere beyond his undead minions, Somit laughed. "I care not for your words. They mean nothing to this horde." Sato sighed and uncrossed his arms, raising them to either side, fingers outstretched. "Horde or no horde, you will not leave this place alive." Somit cackled. "You have a horde. But I am the swarm." He clenched his hands, and the earth began to buzz and shift. Kankaro glanced down at the detritus on the ground below him, and saw a single sliver of metal, smaller than his thumbnail, shudder and shake its way free of the surrounding material. He reached out and picked it up, to find that one end was sharp, while the other was splayed out like the feathers of an arrow. All around them, little silver flashes rose from the earth, slowly forming a dense circle around the two shinobi, flying around them so quickly that the dagger Somit tossed at them was deflected into the ground. Then Sato opened his right hand, and the whirling storm of steel expanded outwards. The tiny blades did not cut and slash, they shredded, whipping through the air fast enough to be reduced to a blur. Undead simply disintegrated under the onslaught, reduced to flesh, bone, and cloth tatters that fell to the ground and formed an ever-expanding carpet of remains. Sato took a step forward, and the blades extended outward again, the outermost edge reaching the wooden walls of the surrounding buildings. Those, too, gave no meaningful resistance, and bits of wood were mixed in with bits of cloth and bone. Kankaro found himself watching with awe. Puppet masters trained hard until their puppets could be nearly indistinguishable to civilians and most shinobi. They focused on precision and control. Chiyoba-sama was famous throughout the shinobi world for controlling 10 puppets at once, flawlessly. But Sato's technique was not about precision, it was about power. His control undoubtedly suffered, and Kankaro doubted the man could deliberately hit a moving shinobi with them, if there weren't so many. Get enough blades in the air, and eventually there was nowhere left to dodge. Still, there was one obvious flaw. Kankaro pulled himself up and stepped next to Sato to ask, "What'll keep that scum from simply running away?" Sato glanced over at Kankaro, and to the buzzing sound of houses and bodies being shredded to mere splinters, the man smiled for the first time. He raised his left hand and opened his fingers. "The second ring behind him," he said, as the buzzing sounds of destruction doubled in intensity. A taller building some distance away began to lean, and then toppled with a horrendous crash. "And before you ask, I have plenty of these things buried in the ground. If he goes down, I'll know. But the outer ring is thinner, and lower to the ground." Deliberately, finished Kankaro. The Ishini nodded, and Kankaro couldn't help himself. He whistled, and Sato's smile turned into a smirk. Then his eyes flicked to the sky, and Kankaro grinned. A minute later, a lone figure leaped into the air, neatly vaulting the cloud of silver, only for the cloud to rise in response, the entire ring becoming visible briefly. Somit screamed once, briefly, before he reached the wall. His body began to disintegrate, and when it began to fall the flashing silver ring followed him all the way to the ground. Naruto glared at the streaming form of Sekit. Conventional fighting had ended within moment of their first clash, when the ripping wind of Naruto's chakra blades shredded and scattered Sekit's body. The cultist tried to maneuver and attack from different angles, but with two such blades, the boy was essentially untouchable. Sekit refused to back down. He no longer reformed after each clash, but simply kept his body flowing in a long loop, pushing against the wind and forcing his foe to spend vast amounts of chakra to keep him away. And yet the boy did not waver or grow tired. If anything, he looked bored. Sekit pulled back, just out of reach, and reformed into his human body, allowing the illusion of skin and clothes to return. "You can't win this, boy. You'll run out of chakra eventually." Naruto stretched his arms, stiff as they were from constantly being held out. I could say the same of you, Splashy. I can't imagine it's easy, being goopy like that. Sekit smirked, then started to laugh. Little boy, that is my true form now. It takes more effort to stand here and pretend to be a mere human than it does to return to blood. His laughter stopped, and Sekit glared. Still, this has long grown dull. I'll make you a trade, little boy. I'll leave you and your girl alone, and you'll leave me alone. Naruto snorted. I get the feeling even if I said yes, you'd just come back in a year or so, ranting about how you would finally prove yourself unstoppable, yada yada. He gave one final stretch and held the blades out again. If it's all the same to you, I'd rather we keep going till we're done. Sekit started to turn away, then froze when the boy chuckled. Is that it? The legendary killer is going to run away from a kid? Are you afraid? The boy's mocking laughter turned him back fully to glare at the little blonde shit. I don't need to win, said the boy. All I need to do is keep you busy until someone shows up who can kill you for me. After all, teamwork is a vital part of being a Shino. The boy stopped and paled, taking a step back. Sekit tried to turn, but the blade was already in his back, and he screamed as the searing, freezing, impossible pain flowed into him. He had been cut into 1,000 pieces, boiled, frozen, and not once had he felt such pain. He reached out but found that his hands could not grasp the blade, wilting even as they touched it. His last thought, as his body started to fall apart, was that it was unfair. Naruto watched as the cultist slowly melted until he was nothing more than a red stain that was slowly turning black on the street. Then he looked up at his savior, walking towards him, his blade already clean. Poison is effective against anything made of living tissue. Worth remembering, if you ever become a sentient mass of blood. Naruto winced as he watched the man swallow his sword. What are you doing here, Orochimaru? The snake Sannin grinned. I went for a walk. Naruto stared at the man, then started to shout. You went for a walk. You, Orochimaru of the Sannin, leader of Otogakure all the fuck way across the continent, ended up here at this tiny border town under the control of another secret village, at just the right time to kill an almost unkillable serial murderer, just because you wanted to go for a walk. Orochimaru paused for a moment, as if lost in thought, then stated walking forward. Naruto refused to back down, even if he kept his swords in hand, as the Sannin walked over, leaned down, and whispered in his ear, don't tell anyone, but, Naruto waited a moment, then grit his teeth and grunted, but what? But, the tea shop on the east side of town serves the best pickled eggs in the elemental nations. He stood and gave the flabbergasted genin a pat on the head before walking past. Do keep it to yourself, he said quietly. I hate waiting in line. Chapter 48, Civil Engineering no Jutsu. Naruto stood at attention, waiting quietly as the Ishigakure Council discussed his statements. After the battle had ended, Nagase and Sato had rounded up Naruto's team and Haiden and put them into, as Nagase put it, temporary custody. Naruto might have been inclined to resist and escape, but Temari was insensate, and Kankaro was already being whisked away for emergency surgery. Naruto had found himself in a small cell, under the watchful eye of Sato, who at least was willing to chat about the battle. Sure, it was probably more information gathering, but Naruto was bored and had nothing to hide in this case, so he indulged himself. His wait had been short, little more than an hour, before Nagase had arrived and ordered Naruto to appear before the Ishigakure Council to give a deposition. He'd explained the meeting at the restaurant, the suicide bomber, and what he knew about the various fights, excluding only that Orochimaru had eventually gotten involved, because even he understood what a political bomb that would be. And then, he stood still and waited. This is absurd! Shouted one man, old and wrinkled, his face made ugly with his sneer. We lost several hundred civilians, several days' worth of trade, who knows how much in property damage, and there is talk of letting them all walk free. A middle-aged woman, once fit but now growing plump, rolled her eyes. As opposed to what, Sakata? Starting a war with Sunigakure when we imprison his children and his special guest? She glanced at Naruto, almost approvingly, and he wondered how much she'd seen of the previous Chunin exam. We'll only make things worse, for ourselves and the civilians in our charge. Sakata literally growled at the woman. Better war than stand aside and let me trash our city and reputation. What will happen to our contracts when everyone decides we cannot defend ourselves or our charges? Excuse me, said Sato, glowering at the old man. 3 of our visitors were attacked without just cause by 3 self-proclaimed worshippers of a murderous death cult. All three had some sort of trick that made them either resistant to damage or technically unkillable. And were it not for these visitors, and this young man in particular, we would have lost a lot more. He was very helpful in the evacuation efforts, and killed one of the attackers on his own. He was very helpful in blowing up 3rd Street too. Sakura pointed a withered finger at Naruto. Don't deny it. The entire block was smashed to bits. We don't even know how you did it. Sato stepped forward, his face now thunderous. I point out that there is a circle with a radius on about 2 blocks that is currently flat because of my own efforts. Perhaps you want to point and shout at me? Sakura paled and sat back. He had been strong in his youth, and still had some skill in the shinobi arts, but news like Sato got around, and he liked his body non-perforated. Still, he could not help but say, your damages are covered by your service to the village. How will he pay his tab? The council began arguing again, but Naruto paid them no attention, his mind spinning. They are wrong, but they are also right. Even if I was defending me and mine, I did wreck a lot of the buildings over there. He had little money. Even with Konohagakure's genin pay scale, he would have been hard-pressed to replace a single house, never mind several blocks of them. And working in Sunigakure, he had even less, just like everyone. He thought back to the empty storefront in Suna, and Kankaro's explanation. Naruto stepped forward. What if I could open a new trade route? The room went silent. After a few seconds, the middle-aged woman leaned forward. You propose making up the value by finding a new market? Naruto nodded, then paused. Or rather, reopening an old one. Sakura rolled his eyes. You're suggesting Suna. The biggest problem with trade to Suna is the difficulties in travel, right? What if I could solve those problems? Sakura opened his mouth, only to stop when the woman raised her hand to stop him. She leaned back and stared at Naruto, who refused to look away or fidget. What resources would be required? She asked. Mori, you can't possibly. Sakura went quiet when her sharp glare was focused on him. It costs us nothing to ask, said Mori, her voice calm. If this might work, we stand to become the primary trading partner with a major hidden village, and if not, we're no worse off for the time spent considering it. She turned to Naruto and gave him a small smile. What resources would you need? Naruto thought for several moments. I would need the aid of a shinobi skilled with earth jutsu. Food and water suitable for heavy labor in the desert for up to a month. He thought a moment more. A tent would be useful. That might be possible, Mori said. What sized work crew will we need to support? Anything more than a half-dozen workers will be problematic. Naruto shook his head. No crew. Well, aside from that earth jutsu user, and I'll only need their aid for a few days before I start, to ensure my idea will work. Sakura stood, his chair tipping behind him with the force of his move, but Mori was right behind him and grabbed the back of his kimono, sending him sliding away from the table with a careful and none too gentile throw. Sakura, your presence is no longer needed. Please remove yourself. Mori did not return to her seat until the grumbling Sakura left the chamber, glaring at Naruto the entire way. She sat down with a sigh and leaned back, her arms crossed. Naruto did not manage to keep the grin from sprouting on his face. I am guessing you're the Ishikage, then? She waved a hand dismissively. I am the leader of Ishigakure, but I do not claim the title of Kage, unlike certain infamous leaders. Others have tried to make safe passage to Suna. She gave the boy a smile. But I have heard a few things and seen a tape of your performance in the last Chunin exam. If you think you have a way, I am willing to authorize expenditure for this attempt. Try not to make me look bad on this. Naruto gave a short bow, still grinning. A week later, Naruto stood at the edge of the road where the old trade route used to start. Behind him, Temari and Kankaro stood waiting, as were Nagase, Sato, and Mori. Naruto summoned 120 clones, who began to form a line leading into the desert. Each group of 5 stood 8 feet apart, and one from each group was dragging their feet through the sand, marking out rectangles, 8 feet long and 7 feet thick. Eventually, one clone lined up with each square and made a series of hand seals before slapping the earth. In moments, almost as far as the eye could see, a series of earthen walls rose, each one 7 feet tall. On the top of each one, the clone that summoned the wall rose with it, and when it stopped growing, they vanished in a puff of smoke. At the base of each wall, one new clone stepped up, making the same hand seals. The new walls rose below the old ones, slightly to one side, which caused each of the old walls to topple forward, creating a path of stone through the desert. The new walls were dispelled, and those clones walked over the pathway, inspecting each wall section. When finished, they too vanished. The third clone from each group moved in next, positioning themselves where each piece of the path met, and in short order, each piece of the path was 7 feet in the air, supported by thick pillars of stone while leaving a great deal of space underneath. Only the very first pathing stone was touching the ground, forming a ramp. The final clones looked over the work done, and a few of them vanished, causing Naruto to send out a new crew to replace that particular wall or pathway slab. Meanwhile, a larger crew was summoning several successive walls near the ramp, forming it into crude but gentler slope. Eventually, all of the clones dispelled, and Naruto let out a sigh and sat down on the sand. Mori walked up and looked down at him. That's actually fairly ingenious. We had considered such a thing before, but the manpower needed to build it was deemed infeasible. Naruto let out a tired chuckle. That's me, Uzumaki Naruto, Konohagakure and Tsunagekyure's #1 infeasible shinobi. Mori smirked and walked up the ramp to stand on the roadway, and after a few moments, Naruto pulled himself off the ground and moved to join her. I am curious how far you planned this, Uzumaki. How will you keep the sand off? Naruto shrugged and walked to the space between two pathway slabs, towing the inch-wide gap. I left enough space for sand to fall through here, and there are no walls to catch sand on either side. There will still need to be the occasional maintenance team, someone with the earthen wall technique for repairs and someone with a wide area wind release to remove any accumulated sand, but that's cheaper than rebuilding it or using shinobi runners for trade. Mori nodded to herself. Hypothetical situation, a child falls off the road. What then? Naruto grinned. Same solution as where everyone is going to stop for the night, or if two caravans need to pass one another. About every mile there will be a raised section 3 times as wide as the main road, with a small stone pillar for guards to watch from and a thin ramp to allow access from ground level for civilians if needed. Even a civilian can travel a mile in the desert, and the roadway is its own landmark to prevent people from getting lost. And Suna's secrecy. What secrecy? Naruto scoffed. Suna used to have trade. And frankly, it's not that hard to find so much as hard to get to. And any enemy force taking the road to town will regret it, because I am guessing this thing will be trapped 3 ways to hell when it gets anywhere near the village. How long will you need to complete this? Naruto thought on that one. I honestly don't know. It depends how far I can get each day, or if I get injured somehow. Mori made a face at the idea of Naruto being injured while building the road, but soon she was smiling again. I sent a messenger to Kazekage Raza, to make sure he's okay with this. Assuming no objection, I'd be glad to provide what you need to make this happen. Honored, even. She gave the young man a pat on the shoulder. Come, I have some paperwork to prepare, and you should enjoy civilization while you can. Temari found Naruto slurping noodles outside the wreckage of the restaurant they had met hidden. Workers were swarming the area, pulling out whatever could be salvaged, and the owners were preparing food on the back of a cart. Naruto was watching the work, frowning slightly, from his place sitting on a large stone that was once part of the building's foundation. I've never seen you stuffing your face and yet so unhappy, Temari said, smirking. Her smirk fell, however, when Naruto didn't object or snipe back, but just glanced down at the bowl. They wouldn't let me pay, said Naruto, setting the bowl down carefully. They have to rebuild the entire thing, they have to make food out of a cart, and they refuse to let me pay for my food. Temari nudged Naruto over and sat on the edge of the stone, her back to his. And that bothers you? He nodded. They need the money. They need to rebuild. I didn't ask for free food, I just saw the cart and decided to order. Temari frowned. You're really not used to gratitude, are you? No. Naruto, their folks don't see you as part of the destruction. They don't think of you as the guy who destroyed their homes and businesses and lives. They think of the swarm of clones who smashed summons by the hundreds and carried out wounded civilians. All this in spite of not being a member of this village. Naruto said nothing on that, and they sat in silence for several minutes until Temari nudged him with her shoulder. I'm no good at this shit, so, you were right and I was wrong. She sighed and leaned back slightly. I've always been the princess of Suna, and I don't like it. It's why you pissed me off so much with that name. Being told to retreat, to preserve my life over someone else's, is possibly the worst of that sort of treatment I can imagine. But you were right. So, thanks. You're welcome. They fell into a companionable silence, at least until Naruto started to slurp his noodles. Naruto, Kankaro, and Temari stood again at the edge of the demonstration path Naruto had made, looking out into the desert. Naruto and Temari were smiling slightly, but Kankaro was frowning in an exaggerated manner. I can't believe you get to go on light duty, and we have to go back to D-rank garbage. For a new member of Suna, you get all the cushy jobs. Right, cushy. Naruto snorted. Pushing my chakra as hard as I can each day, eating nothing but final resorts and drinking warm water, huddling in quick shelter for however long the damned sandstorms might last. Cushy. Tell you what, next time, I'll go do some D-ranks, you can build a highway. Temari smirked and gave Kankaro a swat in the back of the head. Don't be a dick, she said, smiling sharply at him. You and I both know we'll get a week off from active duty. Kankaro smiled at that. We'll need that time to write the all-encompassing report the Kazekage will require from us. His smile dropped. And a medical checkup, of course. Kankaro frowned. Temari laughed coldly at him, then turned to Naruto. We'll see you soon hopefully. Be safe, okay? Naruto grinned cheerfully. I am sure I'll be fine. Yeah, I'll miss you too as well. The three genin turned to see Hayden standing behind them, arms crossed and grinning. Good news, he said cheerfully, as if he hadn't a care in the world. I prayed to Jashin this morning, and he sent a clear sign that Naruto won't be joining him in the afterlife anytime soon. Kankaro rolled his eyes and Naruto groaned and pressed his head into his hands. What signs would that be? Asked Temari, curious. Well, said Hayden, for one, I got the okay with Morisama and Razasama to accompany him into the desert as a bodyguard, so there's that. For another, that's what the entrals said, and they've never been wrong before. What entrals? Asked Naruto, going pale. That would be all he needed, his own little pet cultist killing random allies. Hayden looked offended at that. My own, of course. I always have what I need for a fortune, and I don't get people bitching over it. His voice took on a high falsetto. Who are you? Where is my wife? Whose guts are these all over the living room? He snorted at the look on the genin's face. What? I'm not a psycho. What good would a housewife's guts be for augury anyhow? Jashin would smite me for such a weak offering. Naruto set his fists on his hips and glared at Kankaro, who grinned sheepishly. Cushy, he said with a growl. Naruto's first full day of construction in the desert was an education. Naruto sat on the second stone tower, filling out a report to send back to Mori on his progress while Hayden pitched tents and started a fire. The full moon was more than bright enough to read and write by, never mind stand guard. 6:30 a.m., awoke to find Scorpion in foot of bedroll. Brown with black markings. Sting painful but non-fatal. Repeated stings more painful, still non-fatal. Suspect species nests in rock cracks and genin bedrolls, as Hayden had no such issues, although guessing by suspicious crunching later in day, he may have found them delightful instead of disturbing. 8 a.m., flamethrower hit landscape. Lack of flaming cactus implies visible flames were genjutsu, or possibly mirage. Heat still very, very real. Increase initial projection of water usage by 25% and adjust accordingly. Discovered that FRs from Ishigekure are, if anything, worse than what Konohagakure issues. First task on return to village, publicly disclose recipe. Nobody deserves these things. 9 a.m., stone is deep below sand in some places. Independent platform needed for roadway. Concerns that a platform needed for independent platform ECT unfounded so far. 12:15 p.m., flames confirmed to be genjutsu, because no mirage can possibly replicate that light blue coloration. Desert confirmed as sentient, and has shinobi training. Break taken to appease Desert Sama by resting in shade of roadway. 2:30 p.m., turns out, rattlesnakes enjoy shade. For now, they are gathered in groups of 8 to 10 below each slab. Turned clones back to make secondary slabs below the primary ones. Hopefully they will like hiding under the secondary slabs more, leaving the landing safe if someone goes over. Side note, rattlesnake venom very painful, even when it doesn't kill you. 4:45 p.m., out of spare chakra. Total distance created from full capacity is 5 miles without becoming incapable of combat in case of emergencies. Further updates tomorrow. 7:30 p.m. Desert Sama has a frost bloodline. Suspect they are of Yuki descent. Should forward this information to Haku, maybe when fingers are less numb. Naruto signed the scroll and summoned one final clone, who took the scroll with a smirk and started running back down the road. True, Mori probably didn't need that level of personal detail in his missive, but she looked like she could use a laugh and wasn't likely to find it amongst her council. 5 miles per day. Sunigakure was approximately 2,000 miles from Ishigakure. Which meant almost a year and a quarter. Naruto flinched away from the thought. A year of earth jutsu, hot sun, cold nights, and final resorts. He could almost feel it, the future passing of time. He would see nobody but his self-assigned bodyguard and whoever brought him supplies for a year, unless he decided to take a break and take even longer to finish the project. He could lie. Claim it was impossible, that the sand was too loose, the sandstorms too harsh. He could go back to Suna. Hell, he'd volunteered, nobody was forcing him to do this. He suspected Mori would write it off as a good attempt and let him be, but all he could think of was the empty shops in Suna. How many people looked at the work ahead and turned away? What mattered more, making an allied village stronger, or the comfort of a bed instead of a cot and slightly better rations? And who could do the sheer amount of work needed to pull this off aside from him? Naruto looked out into the desert, cold and empty in the moonlight, and made a choice between his determination and the overwhelming, almost impossible challenge that faced him. At least the desert is big and empty, so I can practice the big jutsu without damaging anything. He jumped down from his perch and glanced at the impromptu camp. Haiden was squatting next to the fire, with a pot of water simmering. Naruto inhaled and began to salivate. What is that smell, and what the hell did you find here in the desert that can actually smell good? Haiden looked up and shrugged. It's Ishi field rations. Did you really never read the fucking instructions? Instructions? Haiden tossed the empty foil package at Naruto, who looked at it with confusion. The exterior was blank, just like all shinobi rations. Then he pulled open the hole Haiden had torn into it and glanced inside, to see a very small set of instructions printed on the inside. You're kidding me. Naruto tore the package wide open and glared at the instructions in the firelight. Boil 0.5 L of potable water in a 1 L or larger container. In the end, Naruto found it took language like Haiden's to express himself. You're fucking kidding me. This shit's instant soup. I ate a brick of fucking instant soup for breakfast. And you didn't bother telling me? Haiden rolled his eyes. How should I know what you fucking heathens do? You're the idiot who never looked for instructions. Shit. Naruto was ready to ask who would put instructions inside the packaging, and then realized that a shinobi would. Given a small package to secure and transport, Naruto figured someone like Kakashi or Sakura might hide it in a plain foil wrapper and place it with all the other totally unremarkable foil-wrapped goods. Haiden and Naruto ate in silence, Naruto marveling at an almost edible soup, and Haiden amazed at his traveling companion's stellar intellect between uproarious laughter over Naruto's breakfast. Eventually tiring of friendly abuse, Haiden yawned and crawled into his tent, flopping onto his bedroll without another word. Hey, what the hell, man? I worked all day. You wanna give me a chance to sleep? Wah. Wake me in 3 hours, I'll take a longer shift for you. Naruto grumbled, then glanced off into the desert before hopping off the platform and stomping his way towards a rock outcropping he'd seen before setting up camp. He stopped just before he would step into the shadow cast by the moonlight and crossed his arms. You may as well come out. I know you're there. His words were met only by silence, until a little patch of darkness detached itself from the shadows and stepped to the edge of the light to reveal Orochimaru. Naruto-kun, he said pleasantly, making no move to approach beyond revealing himself. Tell me, how did you, a mere genin, spot me? Naruto snorted. I didn't. The Sannin smiled. So how did you guess I was here? Maybe I just suspected you went for another walk. Orochimaru chuckled at that and kneeled in the sand. Fair enough. It is a pleasant night here in the desert. Cold but not bitter, bright but not blinding. A pleasant night for a stroll. Cut the bullshit, said Naruto. You're following me, or tracking me, or something. I want to know why. You could have abducted me when I was on the move to Suna. You would have killed me back in Ishi. You could subdue me and kill me here and now, and nobody would ever know. I talked with Jiraiya when he was training me, and I know a little about you. You never act without purpose. So why are you here? Orochimaru smiled and spread his arms in a shrug. To tell you a story, Naruto-kun. Naruto blinked, then laughed quietly and sat in the sand. Right, silly me, I expected something more appropriate to clandestine meetings between hypothetical foes. You know, the last person to tell me a story told me not to trust snakes. Orochimaru chuckled warmly from his place in the shadows. A fair suggestion, Naruto-kun. And it is about snakes that my story is about. Long ago and in a distant land, there was a garden. It was a huge garden, the garden of a great Raja, almost like our own feudal lords. It was a glorious garden, and as the Raja was to the men of his lands, the cobra of his garden was to the animals. All the garden's creatures bowed to the might of the Cobra King, and he ruled them justly. One day, however, the Raja's son walked through the garden and came across the Cobra King. I am the son of the Raja, he said. The creatures of the garden may bow to you, but even you must bow to me. The Cobra King dipped his head, as it was true that he owed his fealty to the Raja and his children, but he resented the imperious tone of the child, and in his anger, he bit the child. The boy fell dead, and the Cobra King thought nothing of it as he slithered away. The Raja was angry with the Cobra King when he heard what happened, and he sent his servants to beat the bushes and slay the snake. Among those servants was the man who kept the garden, and who knew the Cobra King well. When the gardener found his old friend, he begged the snake to flee, as he had no choice but to slay the killer of his lord's son. The Cobra King felt insulted, betrayed by his friend, and he lashed out and bit the man. He too fell dead, pleading till the last. One by one, the servants fell to the Cobra King's fangs. The Raja sent his soldiers into the garden, but they too fell. The Cobra King grew angrier and angrier, until no man could enter his garden and live. The garden grew, wild and untamed, and slaves soon began to flee or slay themselves rather than enter the Cobra King's land. The garden grew quiet as the humans abandoned it, and for years the Cobra King stewed in his righteous fury, alone and growing old. He came to miss the sound of running feet and laughing children. He remembered fondly the gardener who respected him. He even missed the imperious boy, who demanded no more than his due. The Cobra King discovered loneliness, and eventually, he left the empty and overgrown kingdom. He traveled for some time until he came across another garden. This garden was glorious as well, all the more so in the eyes of the Cobra King, who felt the loss of his peaceful home greatly. And in this garden, the Cobra King found another of his kind, ruling over it all just as he once had. The old Cobra King looked out to the garden, the wonderful, beautiful garden, and said to the young king the one thing he wished he had been told himself. Naruto waited for a moment before asking, well, what did the Cobra King say? You tell me. Orochimaru smiled and stood, dusting off his legs to the sound of Naruto huffing in frustration. The story has no real ending, Naruto-san. The idea is for you to consider all that you know, and ask for yourself what the answer is. Orochimaru turned and began to walk into the desert, and he smiled to himself when the boy shouted after him. That's it? You literally traveled miles and miles, left your own village to its own devices, slaughtered a nearly immortal opponent, and followed me into the desert, all to tell me a story that doesn't even have an ending? Orochimaru waved as he walked away, and did his best not to start laughing as the genin behind him cursed in frustration. Naruto gave Haiden a swift kick, causing the man to curse. Good job, bodyguard. I just had a nice talk with Orochimaru of the fucking Sannin. Haiden snorted as he sat up. Quit your bitching, you're still alive. Shit, if I hear you correctly, I'd be more worried about packing lube, considering how much the snake guy seems to stalk you. Naruto flipped the laughing Jashinist the bird before he settled into his bedroll. He did his best to drift off to sleep, but found himself thinking about the story. If it was me in that garden, trying to warn the young Cobra King, he thought to himself, what would I say? Chapter 49, Unpleasant tasks are best faced forward. Trigger warning, this chapter discusses the idea of torture, and all that implies. It is not graphic, but it is overt and blunt. Haruno Sakura, applicant 1447VI1. The voice was dull, disinterested, completely monotone, the sort of voice one would expect sitting behind a desk, describing how your insurance does not cover the life-saving medication you need. Yes, a real pity, so sorry, but there it is. The fact that the voice belonged to someone who might well have the same power over life and death for her did little to help. Sakura kept her eyes shut. The entryway to the T&I department was pitch dark as it was, A large maze built into a metal building designed to disorient anyone who tried to escape. At the end of the maze was an elevator leading deep into the earth, and lined entirely with metal, just like the entirety of the base itself. According to her sources, anyhow. She could second-guess all she had been told, but after a certain point you either walked away in fear or jumped in and hoped for the best. Only one such reaction would do here. I have been ordered to be present at this room at this time. My applicant number is unknown to me. I just told you it, said the voice, now slightly incredulous. You told me a number that you want me to believe is my applicant number, sir, she said politely. If there even is an application number, I do not presume that number is accurate. Until you sign the paperwork, your every moment in the building will be a test, not of your intellect or skill, but of your cunning. Sakura had not been idle in the past week. She read up on rules and procedures and theory. She asked family and family of friends for info. And she had very carefully grilled Kakashi for several hours on what he knew about TNI. The end result, after she collated her gathered information, was a series of rules she suspected would be vital to her application. Volunteer nothing, assume nothing, no matter how obvious. TNI was a place where information became a form of currency, and like anyone who handled money for a living, you never paid anyone if you could help it. Stand by, said the voice in the darkness. She did not respond, but she did react. She spread her fingers out slightly behind her back as she stood at attention, sending out several thin strands of chakra from them. They looped around her, forming a fine mesh screen, giving her a tactile sense of her surroundings that did not rely on mere light. With those strands, she could navigate and fight in total darkness. Even dodge high-speed missiles fired at random from that damned machine Ana had, she thought, and she resisted the urge to smirk to herself. The cat whiskers jutsu was a pain to train, literally most of the time, but it was immensely useful when you couldn't see. She spread her strands of chakra slightly, trading off fine detail for range, and was not surprised to find that a secret panel had been opened in a wall, and a shinobi was slowly sneaking towards her. Wherever possible, identify their goals and turn them against them. She followed the shinobi with her chakra, the tactile image becoming more and more defined the closer they got. The male was approaching, arm raised and kunai in hand, his other hand holding some sort of cloth pad that Sakura suspected was drugged somehow. It took very little in the way of consideration to recognize their intention. The moment he got within range, Sakura spun, leg extended, and delivered a kick to the crotch that sent the shinobi into the wall he had emerged from with a loud thud. He tumbled to the ground and started to stand. Try that again, and I promise I'll make you cry. The man lifted his knife and took a step towards her. I imagine you don't believe me, and maybe you'd be right. Another step, but you can bet I will try, as hard as I can. The next step was much shorter. And if you cost me this job, I'll be sure to schedule a follow-up with you to improve my technique before I apply again. This time, the man stopped walking completely. By schedule, I mean I will have some quiet discussions with a few people I know, do a little wandering during the day while you are about your duties, and one night, when you finally stop feeling paranoid about this little discussion. She trailed off, letting the silence stretch off into the darkness. The man shuffled slightly, maybe from unease, maybe waiting for further orders, but eventually he grunted quietly, yeah, and? Sakura smiled in the dark. Even if he couldn't see her face, he was a TNI shinobi, he could probably hear it in her voice. Well, she said sweetly, would I really be applying here if I was going to tell you my plans? Keep it up and find out, sweetie, or else back the fuck off. Ichi, stand down, said the dull voice. A door opened in front of Sakura, shedding light into the dark room, and revealing the imposing appearance of Marino Ibiki, head of the torture and interrogation unit. Framed by the light, his face and eyes were hidden from Sakura's views. Applicant Haruno, we have been watching. Your interest in TNI has hardly been subtle. Sakura stood at attention. Sir, background checks are almost certainly part of the application process. Hiding my interest would be at best pointless and at worst grandstanding. She couldn't be sure, but she thought she heard a small smile in Ibiki's voice. And you are aware that there is no second chances here at TNI? One test, pass or fail. Pass and you're in. Fail, and you're out. Sakura nodded, and Ibiki stepped back. Very well, he said, waving a hand forward. Come with me, please. Ibiki led her to a small guard station down a short and well-lit hall. A simple desk, chair, and door, the station could be a civilian thing were it not for the hard-eyed shinobi at the desk and the man leading her in. Ibiki made a couple hand signs, and the guard nodded before Ibiki opened the metal door to reveal a metal and concrete stairwell. Passwords are non-verbal, he said as they marched down the stairs. Can't simply over here. We aren't currently holding any particularly dangerous or sensitive guests, but when we do, we tend to use verbal passwords as a cover. He walked down a short corridor at the bottom of the stairs that was lined with windows, revealing small padded rooms. Each window also had a heavy door with a lock, as well as several bolts made of different materials. This is Holding Station Alpha, Applicant Hirono. HSA is used to hold potential risks but not presumably deadly subjects. Visiting shinobi who cause trouble at a local bar, supposed civilians acting strangely, and other low-key threats are brought here for sorting. There is usually someone on duty here when we have visitors, but otherwise we don't bother keeping it staffed. They reached the end of the hall, and Ibiki again made hand signs to a guard on duty before turning left. They passed several doors as they traveled down into the earth, each one unmarked and identical to the last. Eventually, Ibiki opened a door almost at random and revealed a nondescript hallway. He walked down the hallway and opened one of the many doors to reveal a small room with a single table and 2 chairs. Have a seat, Applicant Hirono. I have a few things to attend to. Do as you see fit while you wait, but do not leave this room until I return. He gave her a smile that was all teeth. To date, 12 candidates have seen things beyond their clearance during their application process. All but one were immediately failed. He nodded sternly at her and left without another word, shutting the door with a click. Sakura did not relax. There was a large section of the wall to one side of the table that was made of reflective glass, which meant it was almost certainly an observation window. As this was the TNI base of operations, she doubted that window was the only means of observation in this room. So she sat quietly and waited. After the better part of an hour, the door slipped open. Sakura stared as it silently opened just enough to let someone into the room before swinging shut again. Without making a sound, Sakura sent out ethereal whiskers of chakra, carefully coating the room with them. Walls, floor, ceiling, each of them were soon covered with a crosshatch of pressure-sensitive lines. These found nothing, even when she suddenly retracted them all at once, forming a sort of net to catch possible intruders. Still, nothing was awry, so she remained sitting. The door opened and closed 4 more times before she felt someone enter under a well-performed stealth jutsu. As she remained sitting, showing no outward sign of notice, the invisible figure stepped around her. It circled her several times, never once coming within arm's reach, before they began to head for the door again. I was under the impression the test would be harder than sitting unmoving in a room, she said blandly. The intruder halted for a moment, then without a sound, the door opened, and the figure left, leaving the door wide open. She waited quietly for several minutes before a speaker in the ceiling crackled, and Ibiki said, "Sakura, 3 doors to the left. Proceed. Knock 3 times before entering." Sakura didn't move. After a few moments, Ibiki walked through the doorway with a cheerful grin. Nicely done, Sakura. A lot of applicants fail at that part, they get too curious for their own good. Come with me for the next part of the test. Sakura gave Ibiki a slow look, from head to toe, and did not move. You're not Marino-san. The smile vanished. I realize you're a smart one, kid, but I don't appreciate the horseshit. Come along. Sakura crossed her arms and leaned back, ticking fingers as she spoke. First, Marino Ibiki has been careful to always call me Applicant Hirono, presumably for professionalism, but possibly also for the sake of this test. Second, there is no way I walked into this building without being paranoid enough to notice that Ibiki probably does not smile much while on duty, never mind a shit-eating grin like that. Your presentation is far too emotional. Third, your gait is off. Ibiki seems to walk with a firm but slightly stiff gait, while you walk quietly as if stealth is a habit. Finally, and I can't believe I need to tell you this, she smirked at the imposter, but you got his feet wrong. Ibiki was wearing open-toe black sandals with gray leg wraps, not gray sandals with black leg wraps. I'm assuming that was part of the testing procedure, and not incompetence, right? She thought for a moment, tilting her head to one side, and decided to go for broke. Kakashi? The imposter slumped and looked at the glass. I told you the footwear thing was unnecessary, he said, even as he dispelled the henge to reveal her sensei. It's still procedure, said Ibiki over the intercom. There was a click as the intercom turned off, and after a moment, Ibiki walked in. Very well, applicant Haruno. You are correct, so far this has been a test of intelligence gathering. Had you left the room, you would have been failed. Now, however, you must face the second half of the test. I assume Kakashi informed you to the nature of the test. Sakura nodded and tried not to show any signs of discomfort. The first part of the test was for her intellect. The second was for the strength of her soul in the face of doing what she must to be a member of TNI. Torture and interrogation. Ibiki nodded in return, possibly to acknowledge her reaction or lack thereof. The second half of the test is much harder. We will be bringing you to an interrogation chamber. There, you will be required to get a passcode from a prisoner I have been working on. The only rule is, the subject cannot die, or be rendered unable to communicate their knowledge. Understood? Sakura stood at attention. Understood, sir. Sakura entered the interrogation room and sat in the lightweight wooden chair. Across from her, bound to a heavy metal chair, was a female shinobi. Her time in TNI had not been kind to her. Her face was heavily bruised, making her almost unrecognizable. Much of her hair was missing, either shaved as a demoralizing tactic or, more likely, removed root and all as part of her stay. Her hands were bound in front of her, wrists crossed, and Sakura could plainly see the foreign objects currently under the prisoner's nails. More telling, and disturbing, was how the prisoner held herself awkwardly, as if nursing bodily pains including some very deep wounds. Sakura felt sickened at the idea that the interrogators had penetrated the captive, body and soul, in their quest to break this woman. But she was the trainee, not the main interrogator, and it was not her place to judge their methods, yet, Sakura could see no way to hurt the captive worse than the other interrogations had, not physically, but her research had indicated that physical torture was not the greatest weapon to use against a captive. Pain could only be dished out in small amounts, or else the subject would go mad or grow desensitized to it. The goal of such actions, of the pain and the solitary confinement and the mind games, was to make the captive realize one all-important fact, that they were powerless, and the only way to end their suffering would be to give in. After a moment's thought, Sakura leaned forward and whispered quietly into the captive's least damaged ear. Do not react to anything I say. My name is Sakura, and I'm new here. I see what they've done to you, and it's wrong. She artfully choked on that last word, letting a little disgust and fear enter her voice. I can't do anything right now. You're part of my training, and I have to get a passcode from you. I can't pass if I don't get it. The captive shifted slightly and growled. So, what? She coughed and licked dry lips. What do I care, for your shitty little job? Sakura slapped the woman, a hard slap on a cut on her cheek, then leaned in again. I can't help you if I can't work here. Give me the passcode, and I can start working my way into this place. Eventually, they'll have to give me some keys. Bullshit, said the captive, spitting blood at Sakura. Why should I trust you to help me? You'll have your cushy little job, and I'll be dead. They still need to verify the info I get, which means they can't just kill you. Konohagakure's TNI unit is infamous for a reason. They always get their info eventually, because they will take weeks, months, even years if needed to get it. It's not a question of what can you lose by trusting me, because you lose nothing but even more suffering. It's a question of what you might gain. More freedom. Less rape. Time to rest and heal in a cell, and maybe a chance at escape. The prisoner cracked one bleary, bloodshot eye and glared at Sakura, who sat back quietly and waited. After nearly a minute, the prisoner bowed her head. The password is JNN09L02. Sakura resisted the urge to scoff. There was no way they'd give her the code so quickly. She leaned forward again, and let a little steel creep into her voice. You realize that a false code will do neither of us any good. They will verify this. I can't save you if you don't cooperate fully. The captive sat up and stared at Sakura, then started to laugh. She turned to the one-way mirror and, between chuckles, said, Hey, that's a new one, Ibiki. I think she's a keeper. The intercom crackled, and Ibiki's voice was cold and flat when he replied. You're not supposed to break character. Sakura's eyes widened as the subject stood up, her bindings dropping to the floor with a clatter. The prisoner lunged, then yelped when Sakura slashed her across the palm of her outstretched hand with a kunai she had been hiding in her hands. Fuck, that's a bit much, isn't it? Ibiki entered at about the same time that subject dropped senseless to the floor, and he immediately stomped over to have a look. Mitarashi Anko is a highly placed member of TNI who was selected to play the role of the prisoner. She is not a threat. What did you do to her? Sakura stood at attention and held her kunai out, grip first, for inspection. Paralytic, sir. Fast-working but short-term. No more than 10 minutes. Ibiki snorted, and with barely a grunt he tossed Anko's senseless form over his shoulder like a bag of wheat. Walk with me, applicant Haruno, he said, marching out the door. Tell me, he said as he walked down the hall, what was the purpose of that test? Sakura shrugged. I am uncertain, to be honest. I suspected it was staged, because nobody would take an untrained applicant and put them to work on something like this. I was actually concerned it was going to turn into a test of my willingness to do as ordered, no matter what. Ibiki laughed, loud and bright, and Sakura stumbled slightly when he brought one hand down on her shoulder. Quite the opposite, in fact. His smile faded slightly as he stopped and turned to face her. Sakura, any number of shinobi have applied to work here. There is a trait that everyone assumes we want in TNI, and yet runs counter to our goals. It is a trait that our final test is designed to weed out, and you don't have it, but everyone thinks those of us in TNI do, and we cultivate that ignorance and reputation as a tool. What is that trait? Sakura looked up into his big, scarred face, the vague look of cold judgment he seemed to default to when he wasn't smiling. She thought about his reputation, Marino Ibiki, head torturer of Konohagakure. What would a random outsider assume of him? What would they assume of her if she was accepted into TNI? Sadism, she said quietly. Sadism, replied Ibiki with a nod, his face unmoving. Here at TNI, we do not employ sadists, for damn good reason. This is not a game. This is not fun. In the darkness of our little nest, we torture, maim, and kill people we have rendered helpless and hopeless for the good of our village. Our goal is not to spread mindless suffering. Our goal is to get important information through whatever means we must. We sacrifice our morals, our honor, and our reputations to get the Hokage vital information, and the only thing we should ever feel when we hurt a captive is hope that they will give up and accept the inevitable. He knelt with a grunt, setting Anko on the floor gently, and Sakura was surprised to realize that even kneeling so, his eyes were even with hers. You will lose sleep, Sakura. You will lay your head down at your normal, humdrum home, close your eyes, and see the horrors you have inflicted. You will get up the next day, nod to your friends as they pass you by, and then walk into work and inflict even more horrors. You will act callous and cold, supportive and understanding, whatever you must to break your subject. You will make promises you never intend to keep, swear oaths that would make you sick. You will suffer. Think carefully, Sakura. Are you certain you want to pay this price? That you can pay this price? Sakura took a deep, shuddering breath, and for all her effort, a single tear managed to escape her eyes and run down her face, but she felt no doubt. She could do it. So she nodded and sealed her fate. Ibiki smiled and drew her into a hug. Welcome to the family, he said. Sakura found that Ibiki spoke the truth. TNI was very much like a family. Ibiki himself was certainly a fatherly figure. He was involved in actual interrogations from time to time, but for the most part, his job was to watch over the other interrogators. It was Ibiki who ensured that no interrogator went too far, and it was Ibiki who made sure the interrogators didn't break themselves. He was also the picture of cold authority when he became involved in an interrogation, a father passing judgment on his child and finding them unworthy. His cold, dull expression, often brought in after hours or days of interrogation by others, was often enough to crack whatever facade the subject was trying to use to resist. If Ibiki was a father figure, Anko was certainly an elder sister. Bratty, crude, cruel, these were all traits she presented to her subjects. Admittedly, a lot of those traits were true to her own nature, as she gleefully admitted more than once, but where they were well-intentioned and humorous for her friends and allies, for her subjects, she acted as if their mind and body remained whole only on her whim and patience. Sakura learned how to physically torture subjects, and they were always subjects, never people and never victims, but those lessons were mostly learned from a book and theoretical in nature. Inflicting pain could be helpful, but generally in itself was not enough to break hardened shinobi. That was not to say she did not witness, and participate in, some physical torture. It was part of the job, and she had to face it sooner rather than later when the need was more dire. But as much as it disgusted her, as unpleasant and heart-wrenching as it was, Sakura learned her duty in such cases and learned it well. She instead learned how to break people's minds. Pain, yes, but there were other means to do so. Isolation. Fear. Discomfort. Loneliness. Shame. Helplessness. Hopelessness. Even understanding, even friendship, all could be tools that a good interrogator could use to unlock a subject's mind and heart. She slotted almost naturally into the younger sister's slot. Where Ibiki would be cold, distant, and judgmental, and Enko would be cruel and mercurial, Sakura was the good little girl. She would often be charged with taking care of the needs of her subjects. Provide food and water. Care for wounds from Enko's more physical efforts. She provided comfort, even friendship, and she provided it without regard for the subject's temperament. And after each session, she went to her desk and filled out her report, including any little hints the subject may have dropped to indicate the next step to take in the path to their destruction. When Anbu delivered the kunai cutter, a shinobi who had been caught killing a civilian family in a gruesome manner and suspected for a string of disappearances, he'd not reacted in the least to Enko's torture or Ibiki's judgment, but one murmur of understanding from Sakura had gotten him talking. He explained his desire to be respected, his need to kill any who disrespected him, his sad story of his family being dishonored in his youth. She accepted it all without judgment, and he just kept talking, about the clever ways he hid the bodies, how carefully and skillfully he disassembled his victims, and how useful he would have been for TNI if they hadn't failed his application. Sakura gave him a pleasant meal, eased his pains, and agreed with the injustice of his treatment. She took notes on a letter he wanted to send to the Hokage, swearing on his reformation and renewing his pledge of service. She delivered her report to Ibiki afterwards, and managed to almost make it to the bathroom before she got sick on the floor. Enko visited her in the bathroom after a few minutes to give her some water, pat her on the back, and explained gently that he'd been so talkative in his confession that there had been no need for a formal trial, and on order of the Hokage he was already dead. Ibiki had given her a hug and told her she'd done a good job. And Sakura went home that night and cried into her pillow while Kiri purred in her ear comfortingly. The next day, she got up, pulled herself together, and went to work, much to the surprise of both of her superiors. Ibiki offered to grant her a day off, as they had little to do but paperwork, but she declined. There was work to be done, and every part she did was that much less the others had to. They were family. And of course, you could always go find Tora. Sasuke fought to keep his face blank. Konohamaru had paled immensely when the Hokage mentioned the constantly troublesome cat, and even Ebisu flinched slightly, which was impressive. Sasuke had grown used to seeing the various genin teams each day, and Ebisu had always struck him as a serious and stoic shinobi. The knowledge that even someone like Ebisu would flinch when faced with another Tora mission was somehow comforting, a sort of unifying rite of passage for all Konohagakure shinobi. It was also, unarguably, hilarious. Sasuke was almost certain that Iruka was fighting back a laugh, and he was completely certain that Hiruzen was using the tip of his pipe to hide the uptick on the side of his mouth. Yes, said the Hokage, handing over a scroll, I think another day of Tora will do your team good, Ebisu. Good luck. Team Ebisu stood at attention, except for Konohamaru, who crossed his arms and glared until Ebisu swatted the back of his head, to which Iruka almost broke character with a chuckle. The moment the genin left, Iruka's indifferent mask broke and he snorted. That's what, third time this week, Hokage-sama. Hiruzen nodded, allowing himself to smile as well as he shuffled through his paperwork. I can't help but notice that we get even more Tora missions than I recall from your early days, Sasuke. I am quite curious if that has something to do with Miss Haruno and her summons. Sasuke smirked. She might have something to do with it. Tora was already halfway to shinobi status when we first started chasing her. I would not be surprised if Kiri gave that cat some tips. Hiruzen chuckled at that. Were she not so focused on TNI, I'd send her to you, Iruka. I've never seen a genin do so much to teach others how to be shinobi, even if her intent might be more malicious than normal. Can you add a commendation to her file when you have a moment, Iruka? Direct improvement on training quality of D-rank missions, that should work. Iruka nodded to himself and made a note on his clipboard. I think that's it for the genin teams. I got a message from Madogai and Sarutobi Asuma that their genin were doing a group training exercise and would not be taking D-ranks today. Hiruzen grunted and started closing books. Right, thank you, Iruka. On to the economy reports for me, and the academy for you. Sasuke, would be so kind to make some tea. Sasuke snapped to attention and bowed before going to the bookshelf near the door. Sasuke had no objection to the menial labor. He was still learning the structure of the Hokage's day, and while he was regularly invited to look over unclassified documents and discuss them, he was not yet doing anything more important than tea for the Hokage, and he knew it. He had just started heating the water when the door behind him opened as Irika left, then slammed fully open as someone strode in. The room lost the warm, almost comforting aura that the Hokage so readily brought to it, and without even turning, Sasuke knew who their visitor was. "Hokage-sama," said Danzo, his voice grave. "I have received a report from Suna. Uzumaki Naruto was attacked while on a mission." Sasuke did not turn, did not allow himself to react in any manner. Never mind that Danzo considered any emotion to be a weakness in a shinobi, never mind he could do nothing to help Naruto from here. He refused to react because he would be damned if he gave Danzo the satisfaction of giving the last loyal Uchiha a load of shit over his bonds. By the sound of it, Hiruzen had the same inclination. The Hokage did little but sigh and set his pipe down on his desk with a click. Report: the Kazekage sent Uzumaki out with his temporary teammates on a trade mission to Ishigakure. There he was attacked by cultists. Uzumaki is currently being held by Ishigakure. Hiruzen nodded. "Thank you for letting me know, Danzo." Danzo stood still for a moment, but when Hiruzen turned back to his paperwork, his voice became cold. "An upstart village holds our greatest weapon hostage, and you dither over paperwork?" Hiruzen glared at Danzo, but it was Sasuke who spoke, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he walked the tea set to the Hokage's desk. "I suppose what we should be doing is calling up the reserves and planning the route we'll take to Shimura-sama." He did not look at the older man, but proceeded to set out the cups. "There is no way such a report could be misinterpreted as anything but a declaration of war, I am sure. After all, private messengers outside the chain of command are unarguably reliable, all the more so when they answer only to a warhawk." Danzo turned, his single eye ablaze with carefully controlled fury. "I see the will of fools lives on fully in you, Uchiha. What would your parents think of your weakness?" There was a sharp crack as the teacup in Sasuke's hand shattered, but Sasuke did not look away from his task, proceeding to place an additional cup on the desk. "We'll never know, will we, Danzo?" He stood, stepped to the side, and bowed. "Join us for tea." Danzo glanced down at the desk and the 3 teacups. He refused to show any emotion, but he admitted to himself that it was impressive how Sasuke managed to perfectly pour a tiny amount of tea into the remaining bowl of the shattered cup. "I must decline. While the Hokage works on the economy and I work on emergency plans for when we inevitably come to blows over the imprisonment of our weapon, perhaps you can continue to practice your tea service." He turned without another word and made his way out. When the door shut, Sasuke scowled. "I apologize, Hokage-sama. That was rude of me." Hiruzen chuckled. "This is so, Sasuke, and while we both know why you think poorly of him, he is still loyal to the village if nothing else, and worthy of a little respect. That said, I will admit that is possibly the fastest he has even been deflected from his aggressive policy arguments." Sasuke turned and looked Sarutobi Hiruzen, god of shinobi, straight in the eyes. "Someday, hopefully a long time from today, the hat will be passed. He will no longer be the teammate of the Hokage, but just another retired shinobi, with no special privilege beyond whatever the new Hokage might grant. A new Hokage that will not be inclined to go to war on a whim, but might be very inclined to turn a blind eye to the actions of their peers. Especially once he reads a few old reports on famous events of the village. You know how this story ends, Hokage-sama." Hiruzen sighed, slipping off his hat and running a hand over his wrinkled brow. "I won't lie, I hope he passes before me. It pains me to think of my friend." He trailed off, before he sighed and pulled the hat back into place. "I know how this story ends," he said, his eyes hardening. "And I won't pretend he didn't earn it. But that is then, and this is now. Let's have that tea and have a look at those reports." Hyuga stood perfectly still in the darkness even as he allowed his Byakugan to pass around the walls of the little room he was in. He'd considered ignoring the missive he'd received, he had more than enough trouble dealing with the fallout of Hayashi's foolish decree without tying his cause to a falling star. But something about the way the note was written made him curious, and so here he was, waiting for. "Hyuga," said a voice from directly behind him. Ashi spun, arms out, then stopped when he saw who had creeped up on him. His heart hammered in his chest. Impossible. The Byakugan cannot be blocked. After a moment, he dropped his arms and stood at ease, and while he thought he saw his host smirk at him, that moment passed in a blink of the eye, and the man stood there with the same dull, disinterested gaze he always had. What do you want from me, Shimura-san? Danzo took another step forward and nodded in response to the respect given. I want nothing from you, Ashi, other than to help you correct a grievous decision made recently by your clan leader. The loss of the Byakugan would be a fatal blow to the village. Ashi almost trembled as anger overcame him. I assure you, he said coldly, I am doing all that I can to stop this foolishness. Already I work to gather the other elders of the clan. Already I prepare the needed evidence too. Danzo waved one hand sharply, and Ashi fell silent. We both know that there is no evidence to gather. No rules to bring up. Your clan is built around a single all-powerful decision-maker, and no amount of words can simply make them change their mind. Danzo stepped forward and pressed a small object into Ashi's hand before stepping back. Are you truly doing everything in your power to resolve this problem? Ashi looked down at the kunai now in his hand and blanched. Danzo-sama, never mind the legality and legitimacy issues, I hold only 20% of our clan to my view, and many of them older. Any rebellion would fail before it began. The all-seeing eye is a great boon to us, but it is also a great obstacle to surmount. Danzo nodded, as if he heard nothing unusual, and then the man smiled, and Ashi was both chilled and enthralled as he reached up to the bandages wrapped around his head. And would you say the same if I provided you a means to strike unseen, Hyuga? Chapter 50. Oh no. Another victim of writer's block. Once, there was a man. He was not a good man, nor a kind man. He was not an evil man, or a cruel man. Just a man. War came to the man's home, and he fought in that war to defend that home. But war is a cruel thing, and has a habit of turning men cruel in its process. The man became cruel, and began to do cruel things. He justified it, he lied about it, he pretended it was for the good of his home. But he had become cruel, and it showed. He killed innocents in the name of protection. Fled his mentor, who rightly despised him for killing those innocents. He sought to kill his friends, and only by small chance did he fail. Indeed, all he did was fail. He gathered an army, intending to crush those who opposed him, and failed. He tried to capture a being of incredible power to steal that power for himself and failed. He tried to raise someone so like himself he considered the boy his son, and failed. His life awash in failure, the man asked himself, if I knew now what I knew then, would I have done better? Many men across history have asked that question, but this man found a way to try it and see. He took all he had learned and gifted it to the man he once was, to make the world a better place. In time, the man gained the knowledge he had been seeking, and with it he thought he had found true wisdom. He gathered his allies and crushed his mentor, slew his friends, and took for himself what they once ruled. He brought peace to the land, not with wisdom or kindness, but with hate and the edge of a blade. Nations fell to his power, and he reveled in it. Then, one day, as he sat in court listening to his deputies and generals and governors tell him what a wondrous world he had built, and how much peace was in the land, he heard laughter. A prisoner that he had chained to the wall of his seat of power, for remember, he was a cruel man, looked up from his chains and for the first time in months, he reacted to the world around him, by mocking the man who held the world in his hands. Oh, how the man hated his prisoner! Over and over he had defeated the prisoner in battle, and yet the prisoner continued to defy him, continued to fight. The prisoner would never give up, and the man hated him with all of his shriveled soul for it. What a glorious world you have built, said the prisoner. Look at what you have sown for your efforts. A large chair in a big room and lackeys to do whatever your whim may be. Endless days of boredom and ennui, forever sitting on your big chair and waiting desperately for something, anything, to shake your world and give you cause to leave that chair behind you. I am sure you are filled with nothing but joy, here in your big, empty, pointless room. The man dismissed his deputies and generals and even his personal guards and stood before the prisoner. What would you know of it? He demanded. The land is at peace for the first time in generations. None dare raise their hand against me, and none dare break my law. I suffer to keep that peace in place. For my sacrifices, I have made the world a better place. The prisoner just smiled. Until when? He asked quietly, his voice soft even as he spoke to the man who hated him, who chained him, who tortured him. Some day, for all your efforts to deny it, you will die. When that day comes, what will remain of your efforts? Your men will fall upon themselves like the feral wolves you have raised them to be. The world will fall into chaos and murder and death once more, but it will be far worse, because there will be no good to hold back the tides of evil. Already your people strain and suffer and starve under your hand. When you pass, what will they say about you when it comes time to teach their children about the world as it once was? At what price does victory become defeat? The man was furious, all the more so because a tiny part of him whispered in agreement with the prisoner. He refused to believe it, but the matter weighed on his mind and heart, and one day he decided to leave his seat of power and vanish, to see what he had created and see how it stood the test of upheaval. His kingdom collapsed into anarchy within weeks. 1,000 years of culture and learning and knowledge were destroyed in little more than a year, swept away by a wave of barbarism unmatched in the annals of history. Filled with dread, he returned to his old throne room, now long abandoned, and confronted the prisoner, still clinging to life where he had been chained. "How do I fix this?" he demanded of the prisoner. "How can I make this world a better place, when even complete control cannot stave off the inevitable?" The prisoner smiled, took a deep breath, and died. The man, broken, looked out over the world of his creation. He knew he could give himself the knowledge he had earned in this life to another, and this world need never exist except for in his memories, but it meant abandoning all he had fought and bled and killed for. And he realized that the price of victory was far too high. Again, he gifted his knowledge to himself of the past. He watched the other leaders of the world, and their generals and governors and lackeys, their inheritors and successors, and he realized that all were lacking. All would fail, except for the prisoner. The man rebelled, mind and soul. He tried, again and again, over and over, desperately trying to deny what he already knew. And as the failures and memories mounted, he realized that only one person could lead the world into a new and glorious era of peace, and it was the prisoner. Only the prisoner gained the respect and power needed to make the world a better place. He took the guise of the prisoner and rose into power, using the same methods he had used before, and discovered that the problem with his rule was not his subjects, but himself, for the man had been cruel for so long that it stained his every act and thought. He was not an all-powerful, all-knowing being. He was just a man. He gifted his memories again, and simply watched, and the prisoner in due time came to rule, and his rule was just. But the prisoner himself suffered, having lost all he valued, and the man realized that the prisoner had been wronged just as greatly by the world as he himself had been. But the prisoner never wavered, never gave in, never became cruel. He suffered, but he never let his suffering taint the world he had risen to glory. And then the man made a final resolve, to aid the prisoner he hated so deeply. To try, however often he must, to bring the world and the prisoner to the greatest possible outcome. He found purpose, for only he could gift himself the knowledge and wisdom needed to provide that aid, but he soon discovered a flaw in his plans. Simply telling people the truth was rarely effective. He was met with suspicion and disbelief, and no amount of effort could overcome what the world already knew, that he was a cruel man. So, he decided that if he could not teach through facts and figures, then he could teach through guided thoughts and careful words, to teach without anyone knowing his goal. He taught himself to tell stories. That's it for part 12. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.